Walk into any oilfield supply yard in Western Canada in the 1980s and you would have seen it. That flying goose logo, bold and confident on the side of every stack of pipe, on every load of steel plate rolling out of Regina, Saskatchewan, on every invoice sent to every pipeline company from Alberta to Texas. The goose was not merely a corporate emblem, it was a promise. It said, this steel came from here, from the prairies, from people who built something from nothing on land that foreign investors had already walked away from. The name was IPSCO, Interprovincial Steel and Pipe Corporation, and for half a century, that name meant something on the Canadian prairies that very few corporate names ever achieve. It meant pride. It meant jobs. It meant a town that had its own steel mill, its own pipe operation, its own place in the industrial order of North America, built not with government handouts or foreign capital, but with Western Canadian stubbornness and the very specific kind of ambition that grows in places that have learned not to wait for someone else to build what they need. In 1956, a group of businessmen in Regina, Saskatchewan, incorporated a company called Prairie Pipe Manufacturing Company Limited, with $28,000 in startup capital and a contract promise from a provincial power utility. By 2007, that company, renamed, expanded, transformed beyond recognition, was acquired for $7.7 billion United States dollars in one of the most frenzied steel industry bidding wars the world had seen in a generation. The buyers were Swedish. The price was staggering. The workers who had spent their careers inside those Regina mills watched the number and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, something in between. The particular feeling of watching a thing you built become too valuable for you to keep. And then, inside 12 months, the new Swedish owner broke the company apart and sold the Canadian operations to a Russian steel giant controlled by a billionaire whose other major asset was Chelsea Football Club in London. The goose logo came down from the building. The IPSCO name disappeared from the plant gates. A prairie success story, 50 years in the making, built by engineers and steelworkers, and one famously combative CEO who once earned the description of argumentative and sometimes abrasive from the Premier of Saskatchewan, vanished into the accounting of distant corporations who had no memory of how any of it had started. This is the story of IPSCO, the rise from a pipe mill no one wanted to build, the peak when one company from Saskatchewan became the largest steel plate producer in North America, the moment the world came calling with $7.7 billion, and the silence where the name used to be. Welcome inside the IPSCO story, where a flying goose once told Western Canada that its steel was good enough for the world, and where the world eventually proved it had meant that as a purchase order, not a compliment. 1956, Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. The prairies in the mid-1950s were not a place where people expected to find a steel mill. The industrial logic of Canada pointed east, to Hamilton, Ontario, where Stelco and Dofasco had operated blast furnaces for decades, to the Great Lakes Corridor, where raw materials moved by water and finished steel moved by rail to the country's population centres. Saskatchewan was where Canada grew wheat, not where it smelted ore. The provincial government of Saskatchewan had spent considerable time and money developing a proposal for a steel pipe plant in Regina. They had pitched it to German investors. They had pitched it to American investors. The conversations were polite. The investors were not interested. A pipe mill on the Canadian prairies, far from established industrial infrastructure, serving a regional market that was growing but unproven. The numbers did not compel anyone with access to alternative investments. When the foreign investors walked away, the provincial government turned to a local businessman named J.W. Bill Sharp and asked whether he would take up the project. It was May of 1956. By July 13th of that same year, Sharp's new company, Prairie Pipe Manufacturing Company Limited, had been incorporated. The timeline from request to incorporation was less than 2 months. In the prairie tradition of not deliberating too long when something needed doing, Sharp had moved. The company received no government subsidies. It received no loan guarantees from the province. What it received was something more specific and more useful. The Saskatchewan Power Corporation, a government-owned utility, agreed to purchase all of its tubular requirements from Prairie Pipe for a defined period between 1957 and 1960. A captive anchor customer in the early years, enough to justify the investment, enough to keep the lights on while the broader market was developed. Prairie Pipe built a small-diameter pipe mill designed primarily to serve the Saskatchewan market for welded line pipe. The Western Canadian oil and gas industry was growing. Pipelines were being built across the prairies. Steel pipe was the physical infrastructure of energy development. There was a market. It was not enormous, but it was real. But here's what the ledgers were already showing. Some of the original investors in Prairie Pipe believed that a pipe company without its own steel supply was permanently vulnerable. They were not wrong, and their response to that vulnerability would create, almost by accident, the financial crisis that defined IPSCO's earliest years and set the tone for everything that followed. The second company formed by those investors would nearly sink the first one before either of them had truly begun. 1959. Regina, Saskatchewan. The investors who had backed Prairie Pipe Manufacturing looked at what they had built and saw a business with a structural problem. A pipe company that purchased its steel from outside suppliers was a company permanently at the mercy of those suppliers, their pricing, their priorities, their production decisions. The solution seemed obvious. Build a steel mill, control the raw material, integrate the supply chain from the beginning. In 1957, many of the original Prairie Pipe investors formed a separate company called Interprovincial Steel Corporation and began constructing a small steel mill on land adjacent to Prairie Pipe's pipe operation north of Regina. The steel mill, unlike Prairie Pipe, was supported by provincial government-backed loan guarantees. It was a more ambitious project than the pipe mill. It was also a more troubled one. The steel company ran into financial difficulties, serious ones. The project was partially built and carrying significant liabilities when it became clear that Interprovincial Steel Corporation alone could not survive the weight of its own construction costs. In 1959, Prairie Pipe, the pipe company that had originally been the smaller, simpler operation, purchased all the assets of Interprovincial Steel Corporation. Those assets consisted of a partially built steel mill and a debt load that would have crushed a less determined organization. The merger had one important political consequence. The government of Saskatchewan, through its loan guarantees to the steel company, became a minor shareholder in the enlarged enterprise. The province would hold that interest until the mid-1980s, when it was quietly disposed of as IPSCO's trajectory became clearly private sector and Northward American rather than provincial in character. Prairie Pipe changed its name to Interprovincial Steel and Pipe Corporation following the merger. In 1960, steel production began at the newly combined Regina facility. The company that would eventually be known everywhere simply as IPSCO had its full operational identity for the first time. A steel maker and a pipe maker sharing a site, sharing a logic, sharing the conviction that Western Canada deserved its own industrial backbone. But here's what the ledgers were already showing. A company born from a near insolvency, carrying the weight of a partially built steel mill purchased out of financial distress, operating in a regional market that offered modest volume rather than national scale. The next phase of IPSCO's story would depend entirely on the quality and vision of the people placed in charge of it. The men who ran IPSCO through the 1960s and 70s built the Western Canadian foundation, but it was the arrival of a single, extraordinarily driven leader in the 1980s that would transform a regional success story into a continental one. 1965, Regina, Saskatchewan. By the mid-1960s, Bill Sharp was stepping back from the day-to-day running of the company he had incorporated less than a decade earlier. In 1965, a man named Jack Turvey was named president of what was still officially called Interprovincial Steel and Pipe Corporation, though nearly everyone associated with it had already begun calling it IPSCO, the acronym that would become its formal name in 1984. Turvey and his successor Jim McLennan ran IPSCO from the early 1960s until 1982. This two-decade period of leadership established the company's identity as the premier producer of pipe and steel in Western Canada. It was not glamorous growth. It was methodical, technically competent, responsive to the specific needs of the Western Canadian oil and gas industry that was the company's core customer base. The growth happened in deliberate stages. IPSCO added 4 new furnaces to its Regina steelmaking operation, expanding production capacity incrementally as the market demanded it. A new rolling mill was added. The company built large-diameter pipe capacity using a technology imported from Germany called spiral pipe manufacturing, a process in which steel strip is fed into a forming machine at an angle and welded along a continuous spiral seam, producing large-diameter pipe of varying dimensions from a single coil of steel. Spiral pipe technology allowed IPSCO to compete for contracts supplying the major natural gas and oil transmission pipelines being built across Canada in the 1960s and 70s. The company also grew through acquisition. Canadian Phoenix Steel and Pipe Limited and other smaller pipe mills in Western Canada were absorbed into IPSCO's operations during this period, extending its geographic reach into Alberta and British Columbia, while consolidating its position as the dominant Western Canadian supplier of tubular products. By the time IPSCO reached the early 1980s, the company had produced 389,000 ingot tons of steel in the year 1981, a number that looked respectable for a regional producer. The operations included facilities in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. The goose logo had become familiar along the highway running north of Regina, where the plant sat visible against the flat prairie horizon. Then, something nobody wanted to name out loud arrived with the global recession of the early 1980s. Steel markets contracted. Energy prices collapsed. The Western Canadian oil and gas industry, IPSCO's most important customer base, entered a period of severe contraction. The company that had built itself on the back of Western Canadian resource development suddenly found itself caught in the arithmetic of an industry downturn that threatened to undo 20 years of careful construction. What happened next would depend on the person brought in to fix it. 1982, Regina, Saskatchewan. Roger Phillips arrived at IPSCO in 1982, when the company was fighting for its financial survival in the middle of the worst recession the Western Canadian steel industry had experienced since the 1930s. He was not a steelman by background. He was a former civil servant, a federal government official with a reputation for analytical rigor, an argumentative personality, and a level of public policy sophistication that was unusual in the corner offices of industrial companies. The Premier of Saskatchewan, Roy Romanow, would later say of Phillips that there were days when he left their meetings vowing never to meet with the IPSCO CEO again. He always went back because he knew Phillips understood something most industrialists did not, that a company operated inside a society, and that what happened to that society would eventually happen to the company. Phillips was not only a manager, he was, in the description of people who knew him, a passionate Canadian and public policy enthusiast who grasped the big picture. What Phillips grasped most immediately upon taking charge of IPSCO was that the company's production model was obsolete. IPSCO was still making steel the old way, pouring ingots that then had to be reheated and processed. Phillips switched the company to continuous casting, a technology by which molten metal is solidified directly into a slab of flat steel, without the intermediate ingot stage. Continuous casting was faster, more efficient, and produced a higher quality product. The transition required capital investment that IPSCO did not easily have. Phillips found the capital and made the change. He then did something even more significant. He looked at IPSCO's customer base, overwhelmingly Western Canadian, overwhelmingly dependent on the energy industry's cyclical fortunes, and concluded that a company with that exposure had permanently limited itself. The solution was the United States. Not the whole United States, the specific, growing American market for thick steel plate used in construction, in energy infrastructure, in heavy equipment manufacturing. IPSCO began investing in US facilities. It became, in stages, a North American company rather than a Western Canadian one. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. 1997, Montpelier, Iowa, United States of America. The mini-mill at Montpelier, Iowa, that IPSCO opened in 1997 was not merely an American expansion. It was a statement of technological ambition. Roger Phillips and his engineering teams had spent years developing manufacturing technology in Regina, the continuous caster, the reheat furnace, and then applied those innovations to a new concept, a revolutionary plate mill that incorporated elements of the thin slab casting technology that had driven the American mini-mill revolution in sheet steel, but adapted for the production of thick plate. The Montpelier facility could produce steel plate at a significantly lower cost than traditional methods, while maintaining the quality standards that high-value customers in construction and energy required. The plant investment at Montpelier was approximately $360 million United States dollars. The technology was genuinely innovative, not a copy of what others were doing, but an original contribution to steel manufacturing technique that drew on 2 decades of process development in Saskatchewan. IPSCO had arrived in Iowa not as a foreign company importing a foreign approach, but as a company with something specific to offer the American market. In 2001, IPSCO opened a second American plate mill, this one in Mobile County, Alabama, near the Gulf Coast. The Alabama facility cost $425 million United States dollars and was designed specifically to serve the energy industry concentrated along the Gulf of Mexico. Its mill stand housings were, at the time of construction, believed to be the largest single-piece cast mill housings in the world, each weighing 350 tons. The Alabama mill could produce 1,250,000 tons of steel annually. Combined with the Iowa facility, IPSCO had built a North American plate production capacity that no competitor could match without significant capital investment. The results confirmed the bet. By 2004, 2 of the major American producers who had competed with IPSCO in the plate market had vacated that market entirely. A third had gone bankrupt, though its facilities continued under different ownership. IPSCO had won the North American plate market through a combination of technological investment, operational discipline, and the willingness to commit enormous capital to facilities in states where the company had no prior history. By this point, 70% of IPSCO's operations by assets and customers were located in the United States. The operational headquarters had moved to the Chicago suburb of Lisle, Illinois in 1999, though Roger Phillips continued to live in Regina and kept the company's registered office there. The Prairie Company had grown into something the prairies could not contain. But here's what the ledgers were already showing. The company's center of gravity had shifted permanently southward, and the man who had driven that shift was preparing to retire, leaving behind an empire that was now too large, too valuable, and too strategically significant to remain independent in the new world of global steel consolidation that was reshaping the entire industry. What came next arrived not as a single event, but as a cascade, a bidding war that would determine who owned Western Canada's most improbable industrial success story. 2002, Regina, Saskatchewan. When Roger Phillips retired from IPSCO in 2002, the company's steelmaking capacity had reached 3.5 million tons annually, nearly 9 times the 389,000 tons it had produced in 1981 when Phillips had taken charge. The increase was not incremental, it was transformational. Under 2 decades of Phillips's leadership, IPSCO had become the most valuable Canadian steel company, surpassing more established Eastern Canadian counterparts that had been in the business for generations before IPSCO produced its first pipe. The man who succeeded Phillips as President and Chief Executive Officer was David Sutherland, a native of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, who had been with the company through much of its growth phase. Sutherland understood both the Western Canadian roots of IPSCO's identity and the North American reality of its operations. He continued the expansion strategy, adding processing facilities, expanding tubular capacity, and positioning the company to capture growing demand from the energy sector. The energy tubular business, the oil and gas well casing, tubing, line pipe, and large diameter transmission pipe that had been IPSCO's original reason for existence, experienced a significant demand surge in the mid-2000s as energy prices rose and the North American oil and gas industry accelerated its development programs. IPSCO was the dominant supplier of these products in Canada and a major supplier throughout North America. Its Regina spiral pipe mills were producing large diameter pipe for some of the most significant pipeline projects on the continent. In December 2006, Sutherland executed the final significant acquisition in IPSCO's independent corporate life. The company purchased the NS Group of Newport, Kentucky, a manufacturer of seamless tubular products for the oil and gas industry, for $1.5 billion United States dollars. The NS Group acquisition added seamless pipe manufacturing capability that IPSCO had not previously possessed, completing the company's product range and making it the most comprehensive energy tubular supplier in North America. The acquisition immediately drove IPSCO's first quarter revenues for 2007 to $1.03 billion United States dollars. The company's annual earnings for 2006 had reached $643 million United States dollars, a record. IPSCO had produced the best financial results in its 50-year history in the final year of its existence as an independent Canadian company. The problem is that numbers like $643 million in annual earnings do not remain private property in a global industry undergoing rapid consolidation. They become invitations. And the invitations, when they began arriving at Sutherland's Chicago offices in the autumn of 2006, came from companies whose names made clear how far IPSCO had traveled from the Regina pipe mill that Bill Sharp had incorporated in 56 days in the summer of 1956. 2006, Lisle, Illinois, United States of America. The first serious expression of takeover interest in IPSCO arrived in the autumn of 2006. A Brazilian steel company, identified in regulatory filings only as Company B, later understood to be Gerdau SA, one of the largest steel producers in the world, approached IPSCO management in November of 2006 with a bid of $110 United States dollars per share. The IPSCO board considered it and rejected it as insufficient. Gerdau came back with successive offers, eventually reaching ranges described as $115 to $125 per share. Each offer was turned down. The financial logic behind the Brazilian interest was comprehensible. IPSCO had built something rare in the global steel industry, a focused, highly profitable niche operation with dominant positions in 2 growing markets, energy tubular products and North American steel plate. Any company seeking exposure to those markets faced either building what IPSCO had built, which would take years and require billions in capital investment, or buying IPSCO, which could be done in one transaction. The transaction that eventually occurred was decided not in boardrooms, but in a single night of competitive bidding. On May 2, 2007, Goldman Sachs received sealed bids from multiple parties at its Chicago offices around 5 in the afternoon. The competing bidders included Nucor Corporation, the largest American mini-mill steel producer, Gerdau S.A. of Brazil, Evraz Group S.A. of Russia, a company controlled through its major shareholder Millhouse Capital by billionaire Roman Abramovich, and ArcelorMittal, the largest steelmaker on the planet. The Swedish company SSAB Svenskt Stål AB was also in the room. SSAB had entered the bidding in late March at $140 per share. The final sealed bids came in higher. Evraz bid $156.05 per share. SSAB, bidding against itself in the final hour, submitted a final offer of $160 per share. The Swedish company had outbid Russia. It had outbid Brazil. It had outbid the United States' largest mini-mill producer. It had outbid the biggest steel company on earth. The total transaction value was $7.7 billion United States dollars. The per-share price represented a 22% premium over IPSCO's market price at the time. The workers at the Regina mill heard the number and did the arithmetic that workers always do in these situations. What this means concretely for the people inside the building. What it meant was not yet clear, but it would become so inside 12 months. 2007. Regina, Saskatchewan, and Stockholm, Sweden. The SSAB acquisition of IPSCO closed officially on July 19, 2007. David Sutherland retired. John Tulloch, a 30-year IPSCO employee who had risen through the operational ranks of the company, was named the new president of IPSCO and became an executive vice president of the SSAB group. The plant gates in Regina still carried the IPSCO name. The goose logo was still visible on the building. For a summer and an autumn, the transition appeared orderly. SSAB's executives toured the facilities, met with workers, expressed confidence in the combined enterprise's future. Olof Faxander, the SSAB president and chief executive, said the attraction to IPSCO had been its quality, a company with a reputation for customer service, operational excellence, and the kind of workforce whose skills and experience were not easily replicated. John Tulloch, now speaking as both an IPSCO man and an SSAB executive, told reporters at the Iowa plants that both the Montpelier and Comanche facilities were important parts of the business and that the company intended to grow. The rationale for the acquisition, from SSAB's perspective, was strategic. SSAB was a high-strength steel specialist with a strong European position. IPSCO gave it a North American platform and, critically, exposure to the energy market through the tubular operations. Combined, SSAB would be North America's largest plate steelmaker and the second-largest oil country tubular goods provider after United States Steel. But here's what the ledgers were already showing. SSAB had purchased a company that was, in terms of its product range and strategic logic, pulling in two directions simultaneously. The plate mills in Iowa and Alabama were aligned with SSAB's core identity as a high-strength plate producer. The tubular operations, the pipe mills, the energy casing and tubing business, the Regina steelmaking facilities that supplied the tubular plants, were aligned with something different. The energy sector, the pipeline business, the world of oil and gas infrastructure. These were not natural complements to SSAB's European plate strategy. They were a different business that happened to share a Canadian name with the one SSAB had wanted. Less than 8 months after completing the $7.7 billion acquisition, SSAB announced it was selling the tubular operations. The price was $4.025 billion United States dollars. The buyer was Evraz Group, the Russian company that had been outbid by 5 cents per share in the auction of May 2, 2007. Evraz, having lost the bidding war for the whole company, was now purchasing the half of it that contained the thing it had wanted most: the Canadian pipe operations, the Regina mills, the energy tubular business that was generating $2.4 billion in annual revenues. The IPSCO name, which had survived 50 years of ownership by the same Saskatchewan-rooted enterprise, was about to disappear from the building along the highway north of Regina, where the Flying Goose logo had watched over the prairies since 1960. 2008. Regina, Saskatchewan. The Evraz Group that purchased IPSCO's Canadian and North American tubular operations in the summer of 2008 was not a company that most people in Regina had heard of before the takeover drama of 2007. Evraz was one of the largest vertically integrated steel and mining companies in Russia. Its principal assets included three of the leading steel plants in Russia, the Nizhny Tagil mill in the Urals and the West Siberian and Novokuznetsk mills in Siberia. In 2007 alone, Evraz had produced 16.3 million tons of crude steel. Evraz's major shareholder, holding close to 40% of the company's shares, was Millhouse Capital, a holding company controlled by Roman Abramovich. Abramovich was, at that period, reputedly Russia's richest person. His public profile in the United Kingdom came primarily from his ownership of Chelsea Football Club, which he had purchased in 2003 and transformed into one of the wealthiest sporting organisations in the world through sustained investment. Now his company was also the owner of a pipe mill in Regina, Saskatchewan, that had started as Prairie Pipe Manufacturing Company Limited in a summer month in 1956. The cultural distance between Roman Abramovich's investment portfolio and the original intent of Bill Sharp's Prairie Pipe Company was not something that the mathematics of the acquisition could express. The workers inside the Regina plant understood it in a different register. Evraz renamed the Canadian operations Evraz Inc. N.A. In June of 2008, the IPSCO name came down from the plant. The goose logo, the flying Canada goose that had been synonymous with the company's identity for decades, visible on the highway entering Regina, familiar to everyone in the city as a marker of local industrial pride, was removed. The Regina Exhibition Association Fairground, which had been renamed IPSCO Place as part of a corporate sponsorship arrangement, faced the question of what to call itself now that the sponsor had a different name. For the workers inside the mills, the practical reality was continuity. The same furnaces, the same pipe mills, the same products, the same customers. The labour union, United Steel Workers Local 5890, continued to represent the workforce. The steel still melted and rolled and formed into pipe, but the company that made it was now a division of a Russian conglomerate whose primary business interests lay in Siberian ore fields and London football. Then, something nobody wanted to name out loud began to shift in the global energy markets that had been the reason for IPSCO's final decade of explosive growth. And when it did, the distance between a Russian board of directors in Moscow and a pipe mill in Saskatchewan would become very significant indeed. 2022, Regina, Saskatchewan, and Moscow, Russia. For more than a decade after the Evraz acquisition, the Regina steel plant continued operating as a major employer in the city and province. The plant produced steel plate, pipe, and tubular products that went into pipelines and energy infrastructure across North America. The workforce, represented by United Steelworkers Local 5890, numbered in the hundreds. The physical facility at 100 Armour Road, the same address where the Interprovincial Steel Corporation had begun building its mill in 1957, remained one of the most significant industrial operations in Saskatchewan. There were difficulties. In November of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic compressed energy demand and oil prices collapsed, it was announced that up to 80% of Evraz Regina's workforce would face layoffs in coming months. The numbers of workers who actually left varied as conditions changed, but the announcement illustrated the exposure that came with being a pipe producer dependent on energy sector capital spending. When oil and gas companies stopped building pipelines, the orders for pipe stopped with them. In February of 2021, Evraz was fined $935,000 Canadian by regulators for workplace injuries that had occurred at the Regina plant in 2019. The fine reflected safety violations that had resulted in workers being hurt. The amount was modest relative to the scale of the operation, but the incident was a reminder of the human dimension of heavy industrial work, the reality inside the mills that financial statements could not fully capture. Then came February 24, 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The Western response. Comprehensive economic sanctions targeting Russian companies, executives, and associated financial interests fell with particular force on Evraz Group. The company's major shareholder, Roman Abramovich, was placed under sanctions by the United Kingdom government. Evraz's assets in the UK, including Chelsea Football Club, which Abramovich had already sought to sell before the sanctions, were frozen. The company's ability to access international financial markets was severely constrained. The consequences for the Regina plant were direct and immediate in their logic, if not in their day-to-day operation. A steel mill in Saskatchewan that happened to be owned by a Russian company whose controlling shareholder had been sanctioned by Western governments was in a structurally impossible position. Evraz announced plans to sell its North American assets. In early 2023, layoffs of over 100 workers at the Regina plant were announced due to drops in demand for pipes. The sale process unfolded through 2024 and 2025. In August of 2025, Evraz Inc. NA Canada was acquired by Atlas Holdings, an American private equity firm. The resulting company took a new name, Orion. The goose had been gone since 2008. Now, the last trace of Evraz's ownership was gone too. 2023 to 2025. Regina, Saskatchewan. Through every ownership change, from IPSCO to SSAB to Evraz to Orion, the workers at the Regina plant had stayed. Not all of them. Layoffs had come in waves tied to energy market cycles, to the pandemic, to the sanctions fallout. But the core of the workforce, represented by United Steelworkers Local 5890 under President Mike Day, had maintained operations at the plant that still sat on the same ground where Bill Sharp had incorporated Prairie Pipe in 1956. The plant still ran 2 electric arc furnaces. The first of the current furnaces had begun operating in 1981. The newer, 133-ton furnace had come online in 2007. Scrap steel was the primary input. Electric arc furnace technology does not require iron ore and coking coal in the way that integrated blast furnace operations do. The scrap was melted, cast into slabs, rolled into plate and coil, and a significant portion was processed on-site into pipe for pipeline applications. Most of the large-scale pipelines built in Western Canada since 1960 had used pipe from this facility, pipe made by the same spiral process that IPSCO had adopted from German technology in the 1960s. The 24-inch mill, the 2-inch OCTG mill, and 5 large-diameter spiral pipe mills continue to operate, producing the physical infrastructure that carries oil and natural gas beneath the prairies. In March of 2025, when United States President Donald Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian-produced steel, the Saskatchewan government moved quickly to provide support. The provincial crown corporations, Sask Power and Sask Energy, announced an order for 10,000 tons of steel, roughly 4 days of melting capacity at the plant, representing support for the 400-plus steelworkers members still employed at the facility. The order was modest in production terms, but significant in political terms. The same relationship between the provincial government and the steel plant that had existed since the Saskatchewan Power Corporation's original contract with Prairie Pipe in 1957 had not entirely disappeared. Then something nobody wanted to name out loud became visible in September of 2025. At an event attended by workers at the newly renamed Interpro Pipe and Steel, the name the Atlas Holdings acquisition had produced, a restored goose statue was unveiled in the plant yard. The workers posed beside it for photographs. People who had worked there for decades, who had watched the IPSCO name come down in 2008, and the Evraz name come down in 2025, stood next to a flying goose and felt something that required no translation. The goose had come home. The name above the door said something different, but the furnaces were running. 2007. Looking back from 2026, the bidding war for IPSCO in May of 2007 was, in retrospect, a precise measurement of what had been built in Regina since 1956, $7.7 billion United States dollars. That number was the market's answer to the question of what a Prairie Pipe mill, built without government subsidies, on the premise that Western Canada needed its own industrial infrastructure, was worth when it had been allowed to grow for 50 years under competent leadership. Nucor Corporation, America's most successful mini-mill steel company, a company that had itself pioneered much of the electric arc furnace technology that underpinned the North American steel revolution, wanted IPSCO badly enough to enter a bidding war. Gerdau of Brazil, one of the largest steel producers in the Western Hemisphere, wanted it. Evraz of Russia, controlled by a man whose net worth placed him among the wealthiest people alive, wanted it. ArcelorMittal, the company that had been created when the world's largest steel producer merged with the second largest, wanted it. All of them lost to a Swedish company that most people outside the steel industry had never heard of. The irony of the transaction was multiple. SSAB, having paid the highest price and beaten the most formidable competitors, then concluded within 8 months that it had actually purchased 2 companies packaged as one. The plate mills in Iowa and Alabama were the part SSAB wanted. The tubular operations in Regina were the part it needed to sell. The company that had been built as an integrated whole, steel making feeding pipe production justifying steel investment, was separated by its new owner along the line of division that the market perceived between plate business and energy tubular business. Evraz, having lost the original auction by 5 cents per share, then spent $4.025 billion on the tubular operations alone, more than half of what SSAB had paid for the entire company. The Russian company got what it had wanted, SSAB got what it had wanted, and the Western Canadian company that had been neither Swedish nor Russian in any aspect of its identity was now divided between two foreign owners, each holding the portion that suited their strategic ambitions. But here's what the ledgers were already showing. No owner of the post-IPSCO era demonstrated the understanding of the prairie industrial tradition that had made IPSCO possible in the first place. The knowledge that a pipe mill could grow into a continental steel giant, given time and the right leadership. The knowledge that the market for Western Canadian resources was a foundation, not a ceiling. That knowledge had lived in the company's institutional memory, in the careers of men like Roger Phillips, who had spent 2 decades making something from something that had nearly been nothing. When Evraz eventually sold to Atlas Holdings and the Orion name replaced the Evraz name on the building at 100 Armour Road, the question that hung over the plant was the same question it had always faced. What kind of ownership, over the long term, would give this operation what it needed to remain both viable and connected to the community that had built it? 2025. Regina, Saskatchewan. Standing at the highway north of Regina in the late autumn of 2025, you would see a steel plant that has operated continuously since 1961, when the Interprovincial Steel Corporation first produced steel on this site. The building carries a name that most people in Regina under the age of 50 will not associate with the company they grew up knowing. Interpro Pipe and Steel. The goose is back on the yard. The plant is still running. The workforce of approximately 500 steelworkers members who show up for shifts at the plant represent a continuity that the ownership changes cannot fully account for. They are the institutional memory of a facility whose history spans longer than most North American steel operations of comparable size. They know where the spiral pipe mills are, which furnace is which, what grade of steel was being made in which year. That knowledge does not transfer to Stockholm or Moscow or Greenwich, Connecticut when ownership changes. It stays in the plant, in the people. The broader story of IPSCO, viewed from 2026, is a story that Western Canada has told versions of many times. The story of a regional enterprise that becomes too successful for the region to hold. The oil sands companies, the grain trading companies, the telecommunications companies that started as prairie cooperatives. Each generation builds something significant on the prairie. Each generation eventually faces the moment when the thing they built is valued at a number too large for any regional equation to contain. Bill Sharp incorporated Prairie Pipe Manufacturing Company Limited in 52 days in the summer of 1956. He did it because foreign investors had walked away from a project the provincial government believed in. He did it with no subsidies and no loan guarantees, with a contract from a power utility as his only guaranteed revenue, on land north of a prairie city that had no industrial tradition of its own. The name above the door is different now. The goose is back. The furnaces are running. Somewhere in the institutional memory of the plant, in the files of the United Steelworkers Local and the provincial archives of Saskatchewan, in the memory of workers who were there when the IPSCO logo came down in 2008, the original story is still legible. The prairie company that became a continent-sized operation. The flying goose that told the world this steel was good enough, and proved it, and was purchased for $7.7 billion precisely because the proof was irrefutable. What happens next at 100 Armour Road will be written by the next generation of workers, and the owners they find themselves working under, and the energy markets that have always driven the demand for the pipe that comes off those mills. The prairie equation continues. It always has. Return to the physical place from the hook, the highway north of Regina. Walk up that highway today, and the building you see is not what it was in the 1980s, when the IPSCO goose logo was the most recognizable corporate symbol on the Saskatchewan prairie. The signage is different. The ownership documents filed in corporate registries reference a company whose name most people would need to look up. But the physical structure is there. The same foundational footprint where Interprovincial Steel Corporation laid its first construction in 1957 on land adjacent to the pipe mill Bill Sharp had opened months before. The sounds are different from what they were at the peak. A plant employing 500 people makes a different noise than a plant employing the thousands who passed through these gates at various high points across 6 decades of operation. But it is not silence. The furnaces are operating. Steel is being made. Pipe is being formed on the spiral mills. The basic function that Bill Sharp imagined in 1956, a Western Canadian steel pipe operation serving the energy industry, is still being performed on this site in 2026. 3 things are missing that will not come back in the form they once had. The first is the name. IPSCO was not merely a corporate designation. It was the compressed identity of a particular industrial achievement. Prairie businessmen building something the foreign investors had walked away from, succeeding at a scale none of them had originally imagined, and carrying that identity through every subsequent phase of expansion. Interpro Pipe and Steel is not IPSCO. The goose has returned to the yard, but the name that the goose used to stand beside is gone. The second is the headquartered independence. For most of its corporate life, IPSCO's most consequential decisions were made by people who lived in Saskatchewan, who understood the prairie economy not as an abstraction, but as the daily reality of their own lives and communities. Roger Phillips, living in Regina while running a company with 70% of its assets in the United States, was a deliberate act of connection. A CEO keeping his feet on the ground that had produced the company. That kind of rooted ownership is difficult to reconstruct once it has been dissolved into distant corporate structures. The third is the clarity of purpose. IPSCO knew what it was. A steel pipe company serving the energy industry, growing methodically, building technical capability, expanding into the United States because the logic of growth required it, never forgetting that its anchor was the Western Canadian resource economy that had created the original demand for its products. The succession of foreign owners have been capable operators of a steel mill. They have not been operators with that particular clarity about what the plant in Regina means to the province it inhabits. The final image is the goose statue, unveiled in September of 2025. The workers standing beside it in the photographs are the people who carried this story through everything. Through the SSAB acquisition, through the Evraz decade, through the pandemic layoffs, through the sanctions fallout, through the sale to Atlas Holdings. They are the ones who stayed. The name above the door changed 4 times in less than 20 years. The furnaces kept running because of the people who showed up for every shift, regardless of what the ownership documents said. That is the IPSCO story. A prairie miracle that became a continental giant that became a global transaction. The goose flies again. The story continues.